Welcome to the Avro Heritage Museum podcast, supported by Museum Development North and Arts Council England.
It's the second half of my conversation with Richard Kaberry, when he will be talking about his work at the museum at Woodford, conducting cockpit tours for the public as well as for a wide variety of groups. Just before he did that, though, I asked him briefly to reflect back on his 40-year-long career in aviation and to choose the one job or period that he would like to go back to if he had the chance.
I think the time I enjoyed most of all was actually the information desk, partly because it was such a team effort. We were a really close-knit team. We worked shifts. We all had a laugh and a joke now and then. We were sort of at the forefront of the passenger experience, really, and that interaction with passengers was something I really enjoyed. And that is reflected, I think, in what I do now at the Avro Museum, because there is a very strong team here. And that interaction with the public, which we do on public days, Friday to Sunday, is something I really enjoy. And it reminds me of that time when I was at the airport with the information desk.
Yeah, we'll talk about that a bit later, I think. What were do you think, the biggest changes that you saw in the airport over your time there?
Well, two very big changes was, of course, Terminal 2, which I was involved in the planning of. That made the airport immediately a lot bigger and a lot newer. But also the second runway, which vastly increased the capacity of the airport. And the second runway was a very difficult project to get through. People will remember the protests, swampy and so on. But that was something that changed the character of the airport quite a bit.
So that chapter, almost a whole part of the book really, came to an end, am I right, in 2003? What happened then?
One of my colleagues at the airport, Louise Congdon, who was the head of planning for a long time, was invited to join a consultancy called York Consulting, which had been involved in the economic impact studies for the second runway at Manchester. And York Consulting had found that they were getting requests for aviation-related work. So Louise was invited to set up York Aviation. The reason why it's called York, by the way, is sort of steeped in history. It's not actually based in York, it's based in Leeds originally, but there is a far back connection to York. So York Aviation was set up at that time, and Louise invited me to join her as a principal consultant. And the work that we did was anything related to the airport's business, really. So business planning for airports, policy advice, economic impact assessment, air traffic forecasting, advice on capacity and infrastructure planning. So a whole range of services we did for all sorts of clients, mainly airports, mainly UK airports, but also airports in Europe. And we did work for airlines as well. Quite a lot of work for Ryanair, actually. Financial institutions and for government. We worked for the Department of Transport on a number of projects.
So that really was a game of two halves, wasn't it? As you say, one half the airport, one half there, and you retired from York Aviation after almost 20 years in 2022.
Well, as you rightly say, Chris, it was a game of two halves. It took about 20-odd years at the airport and another 20-odd years in consultancy, so roughly half and half, you're quite right. I retired in 2022, and like a lot of people who take retirement, initially you think you're on holiday for a little bit extended period, and then suddenly you realize that this is it, and you have to find something to do. And that aviation that I had all the way through, and goes all the way back to the 1960s, that never really went away. I was always aware of Woodford and the Avro connection there, and the Heritage Museum that opened in 2015 when I was still working. One of my colleagues who works here regularly now had retired earlier from Manchester Airport, so I had that connection as well. So I thought I would approach the museum and see if they could make use of me in some way. So I was fortunate enough to be taken on board, and now I do regular cockpit tours of all the various aircraft here, as well as midweek tours for schools and various other organisations, and absolutely love it. And as I've said before, it reminds me of those days when I was younger on the information desk. It's very much a team spirit. You do feel part of a team here.
So for listeners who maybe haven't done a cockpit tour, just tell us a little bit about what happens.
We have a number of aircraft here, including a complete Vulcan, and we do cockpit tours and exterior tours of that aircraft, but only during the summer and only on Saturdays, so not every day. But we do have another cockpit, a Vulcan cockpit, X-ray Mark 602, which is available at all times. So you can always, if you come here, you can always get into a Vulcan cockpit, which I strongly recommend that you do, because people who haven't been in before find it quite amazing how how complex it is and how interesting it is and how incredible it is that the Lancaster prototype flew only 11 years before the Avro Vulcan did, and they're two very different aircraft. The cockpit tours last for 20 minutes. We're very relaxed about the cockpit tours, really. If you want to ask questions, you can do any time. If you want to take pictures, that's fine. In the indoor cockpit of the Vulcan 602, you can sit in the pilot's seat if you're able to climb up the ladders onto the flight deck to actually get a feel for what it would have been like to actually fly that aircraft. The Lancaster is a replica aircraft, but everything inside it is from a real Lancaster. So when you're inside the Lancaster, it will be exactly like it would have been on a real Lancaster. And for each aircraft, we have people who are experts in that field. So we have 2 ex-Vulcan pilots here who obviously can tell us a great deal about the flying experience as well. We have people who specialize in the Lancaster or specialize in the Nimrod, people who worked on the Nimrod, who know it inside out. So cockpit tours are available on all public days and really recommend them. They're really good.
And how do you find the engagement with the public there?
For me, it's the most interesting part. You do get some people who really know very little about airplanes but are still interested. On the other end of the scale, you get people who know quite a lot about airplanes. We get pilots. In here, for example, we have a VC-10 cockpit, and I foolishly started off explaining what various instruments did. I should have asked at the start what this person's interest was. He said he was an Airbus A320 pilot, which was slightly embarrassing. But he said he loved old aircraft and just loved to sit in the cockpit of an old-fashioned aircraft. So we have quite a range of people. And of course, we have people who have personal connections in one way or another to the aircraft, either because, like me, they saw the Vulcan at the air shows and loved it for that reason. But of course, in the case of the Lancaster, we often have people who have relatives or had relatives who flew on the Lancaster, who had some kind of connection with them. We've had people in their 90s coming who had relatives who flew the Lancaster. So there's always that personal connection as well.
That's on the public days, Richard, which is, you said, a Friday, Saturday, Sunday, usually bank holiday Mondays too. And of course, there are special events. But the other interesting facet of your work is on the days when the museum's closed to the public, but we take pre-booked tours. Tell us a bit about those, because those can be with a variety of people, can't they?
Yes, they can. And we have people who have an education background here who know how to deal with group tours, and particularly tours involving children from various schools. So we have very close connections with schools. Brian Frakes, for example, leads on that and has been instrumental in making contact with schools and bringing children in. And of course, we have to bear in mind that the Heritage Museum is there not just to remember those people who worked on the aircraft, but also to gain the interest of young people, to interest them in aviation and to consider possibly a career in aviation. So we have school tours and we have tours of air cadets, and we also welcome people from groups like Probus, U3A, and really anybody who's interested in coming to the museum and maybe learning a little bit about the history of not only the Avro aircraft, but this area and what happened at Woodford here over many years from 1924 to the present day.
And it's quite a challenge because you mentioned school groups. Sometimes they can be as young as 6 years old.
They
can't they?
Yeah.
On the other hand, you might get much older ones.
Yeah.
That's presumably a bit of a challenge for a cockpit tour, isn't it?
It is a challenge. And you also have to, I was taught right from the start, quite rightly, that you need to understand your audience. So do check who they are, what interests they have, whether they're an Airbus pilot. So find out about your audience and where their interests lie. And then you have to pitch what you say to that level. Some people will be very interested in the technical aspects. Some people less so. Some people more interested in the personal experiences of pilots and aircrew. And of course, then you go down to small children. And it's not always easy to talk about a nuclear bomber or a Lancaster bomber and what kind of things it did to small children. So you have to pitch it carefully and pitch it right. But there's always a way of doing it. And the skill is to gain those people's interest and enthusiasm, and hopefully they will leave knowing just a few things that they didn't know before, and maybe having an interest in how planes fly and how they stay in the air, and maybe developing an interest in aviation for the future.
Yeah. It's worth saying, isn't it? If you do all 4 cockpit tours, by the time you've done that, look around the museum, you've got a pretty busy programme, haven't you, for a museum visit?
Absolutely. You could easily spend a whole day here doing the cockpit tours and looking around the museum. We have virtual reality Lancaster operation to Berlin, which is absolutely fabulous. We have a sub-hunter. There is a cafe, so you could have lunch as well. So you could easily spend a day here, but many people come and do a little bit or a morning and then maybe come again on another occasion. There's plenty to do.
You mentioned earlier on, Richard, that there is something about the vibe of the museum, the working atmosphere. Just finish off by telling us just a little bit more about that.
Yes. When I first came here, I was struck by the range of skills and experience and expertise there is here. A lot of people worked in the RAF, in the military. We have some pilot. A lot of people worked at Avro, either at Chatterton or at Woodford, or both. And we have former teachers, we have electricians, we have engineers. The range of skills and experiences is quite astonishing, really. We're all volunteers. Nobody gets paid. We're all here because we want to be here and because we love what we do. There are those people who love, like me, love the interaction with the public. Some people don't particularly want to do a lot of that. They stay behind the scenes, but the behind the scenes people are just as important because they keep the museum going. There's an acquisitions team who bring new material and new exhibits into the museum all the time. Of course, all the exhibits have to be maintained and looked after. So there's an army of people who do that as well. And where we're sitting at the moment in what we call CAE, the former CAE area, we have a number of aircraft which we'd like to put on display but can't because we don't have the space yet.
Some of which we can see through our window.
Some of which
here,
we can actually see from here, yes, including the Avro 707, which we'd love to put on display and show to people because it's a really good example of the Avro, the 707 that came before the Vulcan 698. Yeah, so really wide range of backgrounds and skills. We always say, sometimes people ask interesting or awkward, shall we say, questions during the cockpit tours that we don't necessarily always have the immediate answer to. For example, one of my colleagues was asked recently how much oxygen was carried on the Lancaster. Well, that's not a statistic that we have at our fingertips. But if you really want to know how much oxygen was carried on the Lancaster, we can find out, or there will be somebody who will be able to find out. Somebody will know. The range of skills and expertise and knowledge is here somewhere.
Richard, I always ask this question at the end. Is there anything you would have liked to have talked about that hasn't come up? Because now's your chance.
No, I don't think. I think we've covered most of the areas of my interest in aviation. But I would conclude by urging anybody who listens to this podcast to come down to the museum because it is something we're very proud of and want to show off to the general public. And you only have to look at the comments in the book that we get. People do seem to enjoy it. You can learn something that you may not have known before. You can teach your children about the basics of flying. You can get them on the flight simulator. You can have fun. So do come down.
Long may it continue. Richard, it's been a great pleasure to have this conversation. Keep up with all the work that you do, because I know, as you say, it is very much a team effort, isn't it?
It is indeed.
Everybody
it is
plays
indeed.
their part.
And long may it continue.
Yeah.
And hopefully one day we'll have an even bigger museum.
Thank you very much indeed.
Thanks, Chris.
Thanks again to Richard for the time that he took to chat with us. Just to pick up one point from our conversation, if you're thinking of visiting the museum and you've really set your heart on doing the longer tour of Vulcan XM603, the complete aircraft that you see outside the museum as you drive up to the car park, and that's the very detailed, more technical tour that lasts getting on for an hour and costs £15 per person, 2 people maximum on each tour, then it would be worth phoning the museum before you set off to check that the tour is operating. It does depend on the special tour crew being available, as well as on the weather for health and safety reasons. And that's why these tours are really only a spring and summer feature usually. And you do need reasonably good mobility to get up the ladder to board the aircraft. The alternative 20-minute tour of the cockpit of Vulcan XM602, which is actually only £2 inside the museum, isn't weather dependent and access is much easier. It's still a very good tour. Thank you for listening. We hope you'll join us for another episode of the Avro Heritage Museum podcast. Until then, it's cheerio from me, Chris Beswick. Bye-bye.